We always start with a welcome. What we do for math is our goal is really to spread the joy and wonder of math. So I guess in doing IL SciComm, we're trying to spread the joy and wonder of science as well. A little housekeeping. If you have not already turned on your camera, we love it if you do because it really helps create a more fully authentic conversation. Those of you who have it on, thank you for leaving it on. While we will be encouraging you to talk during our discussion times, right now, if you are not speaking, if you can put yourself on mute, and it is in the bottom left corner if you need to, which is also where you start your camera. We like it if it's possible for you to rename yourself so that we can call each other by name. And how you do that is if you hover over your own picture, there's the 3 little dots, and under that you can hit rename. So some people, like I'm Heather Brown, everybody knows who I am, but it is a nice way to be able to talk to each other, is to be able to see that. We will have Lacey, I'll have Janine introduce Lacey in a few minutes, but she will talk and then we will have some time for discussions afterwards. And we do have just a little disclaimer that we are not endorsing, neither ISB or ISU are endorsing any products here. A couple things to share with you. If you have not already seen the Science Teachers in Action page, I'm posting, oops, I actually just posted it to Janine instead of to everyone. In the chat window, I'm going to post a few links. So the first one is the Science Teachers in Action. The second one is, if you did not hear about this from our listserv, please take the time to join the Science listserv. Here it is. And then if you are on social media, we would love it if you would tag IL SciComm, and feel free to comment or look at our pages for the Illinois Content Specialist either on Twitter or Facebook. And then lastly, okay, we're going to share the post survey at the end of the lesson, or at the end of the session today. All right, I think that's all of our administrative stuff. I will be posting some of that stuff again throughout, and just so you know, for those of you that come on, the reason is if somebody logs on now, they won't see any of those past links. So at some point, you'll probably see me repost it if we have a few more people, join in just because of that reason. So we will have that open. If you have not already done it, that you can click up at the top. If you click the gallery view, you can see everybody at the same time. And we can do that all the way up until we have 25 people if you want to be able to see it all. All right, Janine, I'll let you take over and I will just be hanging out if we need anything. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Heather. All right. I just want to take the time to thank everybody for coming. I see some familiar faces and some people that I've never met before. So I'm so glad to have you all with us today. And I'm really excited to hear from Lacey Wieser, our Science Content Specialist from EdReports. So I'm just going to go ahead and pass the torch on to her now.
So thanks. Really appreciate that you have asked me here to speak with all of you. And so I'm Lacey Wieser from EdReports, and what I'll be doing today is talking to you about our science review and the process, and just in general who EdReports is for those of you who may not be familiar with us. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the presentation. Okay. Can you all see it? Can you see it, Janine? All right, awesome. And so oops, that didn't work. So to begin with, I just want to talk a little bit about EdReports and why materials matter and why EdReports exists. And so before we get into details about the science review, I'm just going to give you a bit of background. And so as we look at the research and as we think about what's important to the classroom, there's many inputs that contribute to a student's learning within the school setting. And so students primarily learn through 2 main interactions: the interactions that they have with their teachers, as well as those that they have with the instructional materials within the school setting. We know students learn by a lot more things outside of the interaction, so their environment, their background, and all of these other influences. But the two main influences within the context of school are teacher and materials. And so because of this, EdReports really focuses on this idea that quality instructional materials are truly a lever for increasing the quality of instruction. And so access to quality instructional materials really truly is an equity issue. In order for students to become college and career ready, they need to spend most of their time within the school day interacting with four key resources. They need grade appropriate assignments, they need strong instruction, they need deep engagement with the content, and they need teachers who hold high expectations. And so this idea that quality instructional materials really truly plays a critical role in helping build those opportunities for the deep engagement with the content and for providing grade appropriate assignments. And so as teachers engage in professional learning to increase their ability to teach, it's really important to integrate the curriculum they teach with that professional learning. So not just understanding content, not just understanding pedagogy, but really understanding how the materials that teachers have helps them with those pedagogical strategies, helps them give students access to those opportunities to learn the deep content. And so the quality instructional materials really support that delivery of excellent instruction, as well as help teachers appropriately assess the needs of their students and then respond to those needs with appropriate interventions, supports, or extensions. And so that's where EdReports really truly comes in. Our mission is to help increase the capacity of educators to be able to identify and demand high quality instructional materials. And so what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about why we exist and what we've learned about the material marketplace since we've come into the market. And so EdReports entered the field in 2015, so we're a fairly new organization. And one of the reasons that we came about is we saw a market when Common Core was adopted, and EdReports first came out with our math reports aligned to looking at instructional materials aligned to Common Core. We saw a market that was flooded with materials that were hastily adopted by districts or approved by states and repackaged with that Common Core aligned sticker, whether they were actually aligned or not. And so all of a sudden, all of the materials had this sticker on the front. We also saw a lot of these new materials claim to understand the standards, but yet they had very little alignment to the true meaning and the intent of them. We saw that schools wasn't cutting it. Sorry, my computer's deciding it wants to do a reboot, so I'm trying to stop that.
No,
So,
no problem.
doing a little freak out here.
Yeah, they always choose the best times to do that.
I know. And then we saw teachers who were really, truly frustrated by the lack of materials. They were attempting to teach the standards. They wanted to do right by the standards. They wanted to do right by their students, but they didn't have the materials. And so they were using any and every avenue to find materials, gather up materials, and just kind of cobble and piece them together. And so
I love this. I was absolutely one of those math teachers, and this is absolutely what I see every day with science teachers.
Exactly. And so we're trying to help that. And so when we looked at what was happening in the field and where time and money was being spent, on average, teachers were spending, and still are for science, but when we look across all the fields, and I think I just froze my camera. Wow, sorry.
It's okay, we can still hear you.
Okay, so you're just going to get a weird picture of me with a funny grin.
It could be worse. You're all good.
So teachers spend an average of 12 hours per week on instructional materials. About 7 of those hours is searching for appropriate materials, and then about 5 of those hours is actually creating their own materials. And so when we looked at where teachers were getting those materials, it was a combination of areas. So about 19% of teachers go to OERs, the Open Educational Resources, and try to find some materials through those sources. About 51% of teachers are finding their materials, primarily those that are provided by their own school. And about 66% are looking for materials that were developed by teachers or other school staff. And so as they looked across, we're seeing about 97% of teachers use Google to search and find their materials from a variety of different websites. Some of the main websites that are used, about 79% of teachers have pulled resources from Teacher Pays Teachers, 85% from Pinterest, and especially for ELA and math, about 39% have pulled it through Engage New York. So those are kind of the big avenues, although there's many, many different avenues that teachers are pulling instructional resources. And again, there's some quality materials available through those different avenues, but there's also many materials that aren't necessarily well aligned to the standards or vetted to the standards. And so what happens, again, is we start to get that equity issue, where teachers who are really good at vetting or understand the standards or understand their content may be pulling high quality materials, but teachers who are maybe new to the field don't necessarily have a solid foundation in the standards may not. And so we're seeing disparity then amongst students, a lot of times based on teacher knowledge or teacher experience on what's been pulled. It also goes to coherence. So as students are getting a variety of resources from many different sources, you often lose that coherence that you see in a quality series or instructional materials. When we look at where the money's being spent, almost $2 billion a year is spent on classroom materials. Of that, it averages about $651 per year per classroom, and about 40% of that is provided by the school or by the district, and that other 60% are things that are coming out of teachers' pockets. So teachers buying resources, buying lesson plans from Teacher Pay Teachers, buying subscriptions to organizations that provide materials. And so, again, we want to be more consistent with how we're spending the money and really leveraging those funds. Ideally, so your school is leveraging those funds or your district is leveraging those funds, so it's not coming out of the teacher pockets. And then when we look at the decision-making teachers often use when they're selecting materials, 90% select materials by ease of use, 75% are selecting materials or using materials that are recommended by other educators, and 68% are using research to support why they're selecting those materials. So at EdReports, we really have 4 guiding beliefs that guide the work that we do. The first is we truly believe that rigorous college or career ready standards can improve and deepen student learning. So whether that's the Common Core math standards, the Common Core ELA standards, or now the next generation science standards for science, those quality standards are really important, both to deepen student learning as well as help build equity for students too. The next one is really this idea that to reach the rigor of these standards, to reach what we expect from students through these standards, what you teach matters. And teachers need high quality aligned instructional resources to do their best work. Because again, otherwise, instead of focusing on classroom instruction, focusing on providing feedback to students, teachers are spending that 12 hours a week we talked about looking and searching for instructional materials. And so that 12 hours a week could be better spent focusing on how to implement programs as opposed to trying to find something to implement and support you in the classroom. Another belief that we have is really that the more information about the market, about what's out there, what resources are out there, the more, the better the choices that can be made. And so as high quality instructional resources are identified, teachers, schools, districts, or even state level can make better decisions to guide what to purchase and put into the classroom in front of students. And then lastly, this idea of lack of aligned resources really perpetuates this achievement gap and these post-secondary access gaps. So oftentimes if students don't have high quality materials, or they don't have a teacher who is really good about finding high quality materials, those students have gaps in their education, and that tends to perpetuate. So again, we get back to that equity issue. And so at EdReports, the theory of action that we use to guide our work is if the reports can help identify excellence in instructional materials, states and districts can use our tools to help them better understand what criteria quality instructional materials need to have in order to meet that definition of quality instructional materials. And then this understanding helps support and increase the demand for excellence. And then as the demand for quality instructional materials increases, and as districts and schools start saying, we're not going to buy something that's not quality, we are only going to buy quality materials, publishers begin to improve their materials to meet this criteria and the demands that states or districts are putting on the publishers. And we've seen that with EdReports. So when we first came out with the math reports, there were a lot of reports that were red, where publishers were not meeting the requirement for the Common Core. Publishers saw that and they made changes to their curriculum. And we're now seeing a lot more yellow and green scores. Red means that they're not meeting the requirements of our indicators. Yellow means they partially meet the requirements of our indicators. And green means they are meeting the requirements of the indicators based on the rubric we use. And we're seeing that shift of a lot more math programs, a lot more ELA programs that are moving from red to yellow or from yellow to green as a result of that shift of demand of districts that are saying, you know what, if EdReports doesn't give you a good score, we're not going to adopt you. And so a lot of districts, a lot of states are using our reports to help create that demand, and publishers are responding. We anticipate the same thing will happen in science as publishers. As our first reports come out, publishers will see areas of improvement that are needed, and we're hoping that they will respond. And then ultimately, by having that increased availability from multiple publishers, it allows districts to make choices to put into the hands of teachers those quality instructional materials, which ultimately lead to better academic outcomes for our students. So before I go into more detail specifically now about our science review, I wanted to first give you an overview of kind of who we are and what we do and why we do it. So does anybody have any questions in general about EdReports or what we do? So I'll pause for a moment in case there's questions. And Janine, you're muted.
Thank you. We have a question. It's from Caitlin Walker. Are these statistics for Illinois teachers only or for teachers across the country?
So those statistics are general from across the country.
Mm-hmm. In the math world, we've been looking a lot at the EdTrust data and the Opportunity Myth data by the TNTP group. And they're both speak to the fact that teachers mean well when we're kind of piecemealing together resources from several different places, but a lot of times we lose rigor and coherence when we do that. And we just need to be really, really careful that we're putting together materials that put the cognitive load on our students. Otherwise, we're lowering our expectations, and then our students aren't achieving at the high levels we want them to be.
Absolutely. And again, I think if teachers had high quality materials that their districts adopted that didn't have the gaps that they have, teachers would not have to spend as much time trying to piecemeal those. And that's part of the demand that we're trying to create for districts to put on the publisher, and the pressures we're trying to put on the publishing companies is to get them to respond by filling those gaps, so teachers don't have to go out and find all of those resources on their own. And so that way you get that increased coherence, that increased rigor that I think all of us really want for our students. Are there any other questions before I move on? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on, and if you're slow typing, I'll pick you up at the next break I do. So our science review is our first science review. So this is the first time EdReports has really gone into the area of science. And so before starting this review, which is focused on 6 series for grades 6 through 8, and I'll talk a little bit more about why we chose those grades, we did what we call a listening and learning tour. And that's really to understand the NGSS instructional materials landscape and the needs that are out there. And so for our listening and learning tour, we interviewed over 50 science education experts from around the country, researchers, developers of the framework, developers of the NGSS, to really get an idea of what is needed to understand what the needs in the field are and what our rubric that we evaluate materials should look like. And so some of the results of that listening and learning tour was this general agreement that grades 6 through 8 is a grade band that right now, at the time when we started the reviews, had the most materials on the market that actually claimed alignment to the NGSS. And again, one of the things we look for in our reviews are those materials that are claiming that they're aligned to the standards. And we want to review whether they truly are aligned or not. And middle school seemed to be the richest area to start with what was on the market when we started this process. It was also targeted as a starting point as we considered state adoptions and where different states were in their adoption process, what grade bands they would be starting their materials adoption for, and what their focus was. The other thing is with NGSS, we have K-5 standards, and then all of a sudden middle school's in a big band. And so there's not 6th, 7th, and 8th grade standards the way NGSS was developed. The way states have chosen to adopt the standards varies as we look from state to state across the country. So some states have adopted it as just a middle school band and it leaves it up to the districts to decide what's taught when and where. Some states have a preferred sequence. So they said, this is what we prefer, but districts can divide these standards up however they choose. And then some states, as they've adopted, actually made specific decisions and said, we are going to put these performance expectations in 6th grade, this set of performance expectations in 7th grade, and another set in 8th grade. So we saw a lot of variability, so there was a bigger need instantly for middle school because of the way the standards were developed as well, which is another reason we decided to start with middle school. We are looking in our reviews at middle school as an entire series. So because a lot of the middle school programs are modular, where they're designed where you could teach an earth science module in 6th grade or in 7th grade or in 8th grade to account for the variability across the states, we will not be having a 6th grade, a 7th grade, or an 8th grade middle school report. We will have one big general middle school report that covers the full 3 grades to look to see whether they've met that full progression that's required for the middle school grade band for NGSS. So this is a little bit different if you're used to looking at ELA or math reports that typically have grade level up through 8th grade. High school's kind of its own separate thing for especially high school math. But we're looking at a grade band report. And then because this is our inaugural review, we're developing the tool, we're developing the rubric, we're developing the evidence guides as we're going through the process and as we're getting feedback from the reviewers. And so we needed to start with a small number. So if we needed to change the indicator, we weren't making the change across many different programs. So that's why we started with only 6 programs, is so that there's flexibility. And I will say we have changed indicators several times and changed our evidence guides several times as we've worked through this process, because what seemed like it was going to capture what we hoped it didn't as the reviewer started digging into work. And so it's kind of like in the classroom when you develop a rubric for your students and you get the product back and you'd say, okay, they gave me what I asked for, but I didn't ask for the right thing. And so we've had to make some of those changes as well, which is why anytime we do an inaugural review, we start small, is so that we have the flexibility to make any needed changes. So overall, our review process is a pretty deep process that the reviewers go through. And so this slide provides an overview of what our process is. For science, we actually began in April for this round of reviews. And we assembled the 6 review teams for training. And so what happens with our reviews is we bring together the review teams, and review teams typically have 5 people, and I'll go into the composition of the teams a little bit deeper, future slides. But we train them on the tools, we train them on a consensus scoring protocol, and then we arrange for a publisher orientation. So we try to have a good working relationship with the various publishers so that the publishers can then do a Zoom call with our reviewers and they can get an overview and understanding of how the materials are designed, how they're laid out, how all the pieces work, where the assessments are, and that big picture understanding, as well as ask any questions. We also then try to maintain a really good working relationship with the publishers. So as our reviewers have questions during the process, most of the time the publishers are very responsive in providing that. So if our reviewers are asking, I'm having a hard time figuring out what you're calling formative assessments, we can ask that question, and publishers typically respond to help reviewers make sure that they're not missing anything in the process. Then what happens is after they've been oriented and they receive their materials, reviewers work independently, and so they're working at their home sites and they're really going through those instructional materials to gather evidence. And again, they're using the tools and the evidence guides that we've provided. And then once a week, they get together and have a Zoom call where they come to consensus. So they'll often do 1 or 2 indicators a week, go to their materials, find the evidence, each come up independently with a score that they have. And then on that weekly call, they talk about the score, they talk about the evidence that supports that score, and they reach consensus. And this process typically takes 4 to 6 months. In an inaugural review, it takes longer because we're also refining and developing the tool. So it's taking us like 8 or 9 months for the inaugural review, but typically once reviews start going and the tool is well developed, it's about a 4 to 6 month process, depending on the complexity of the program. Within every review team, we also have a team lead and a writer, and they meet with their team once a week, but then they also have a separate meeting once a week with all the other team leads and all the other writers. And the purpose of that is to make sure that they understand what they're looking for in the rubric, what the evidence should look like. So as they go to their team the following week, they make sure that the evidence actually matches. And the purpose of this is really to help build that consistency from rater to rater to make sure that everybody's using the tool in the same way. And then once we're finished with the whole process and all of the evidence is collected for all of the indicators, the writers have written the reports for each indicator, then EdReports compiles all of those reports and we share them with the publishers. We give the publishers 3 weeks to respond and give us any feedback. So in case that the reviewers miss something, the publishers have that opportunity to say, hey, you totally missed this key piece of information. Once we get that publisher feedback, EdReports takes a look and decides, did we actually miss something? And if we did, we send it back to the review teams to have them reconsider and rescore. If EdReports looks at it and says, no, we didn't miss it, you just don't like our answer, then we go ahead and we publish the reports. We always give the publisher the opportunity to publish a response along with the report. So they can always give the, well, but this, or we don't agree because. So publishers always have that opportunity to have their report, their response next to our report. So we want to make this as objective and as fair to everyone as possible. As for our review teams, as I mentioned before, we have 5 different team members on our review team. And these are really a diverse set of educators. We review and recruit from across the country. We look for teachers in different roles. So we have some people who are classroom teachers. We have some people who are district coordinators. We have some who work at county offices or are teachers on special assignments. We have some reviewers who are at state level positions. And so we really have this wide range of reviewers in terms of what roles they are. We have multiple states. We look at different grade level expertise for science. As we thought about composing our team, we also looked at content disciplines. So for each team, we tried to find somebody who was strong in life science, somebody who was strong in earth space science, somebody who was strong in physical science, and then somebody who had a strong engineering design background as well as we looked at composing the teams. We really dig deep into these materials. That every page is looked at. And so when you think of a whole curriculum and going through and reviewing every single page, that's what we do, which is why it typically takes 4 to 6 months to complete a review, is because this isn't a dipstick review, it's an actual deep dive into the materials to really look at what the materials have. And then the other thing we really look for when we select reviewers is we want to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest. So if a reviewer is currently using a curriculum, it doesn't mean that they can't be on a review team, but they cannot be on the review team for that curriculum because there's a chance of bringing in personal biases based on it. or if a reviewer has worked for a publisher and developed curriculum, they can't assess anything they've developed. And then depending what they're developing, you know, we look at those each individually to make sure there's absolutely no conflict of interest. Because again, we want to make sure that the reviews represent the materials and not various biases that people may bring into the process. And so within that team of 5, there's 3 reviewers, and their sole job really is to collect the evidence for the indicators, provide that score, the rationale for the score, and then submit their scores, their rationale, and their evidence for those weekly consensus scoring conversations. And so their responsibility is to attend that weekly team virtual call, as well as do the reviews and digging into the materials in between those calls. And that's depending on the report, depending on the experience of the reviewer and how quickly they read and a number of factors. That's about a 5 to 10 hour a week commitment that these reviewers are making in order to dig into the materials. We also have a facilitator. The facilitator is a reviewer plus extra roles. So the facilitator does all of the same things that the reviewer does, but then they also gather all of that reviewer evidence each week and synthesize it into a document, so it makes it easier to have those consensus scoring conversations. And then they're the ones who schedule the agendas and they facilitate the consensus scoring of those conversations. And so the facilitator not only attends the weekly team call, but they also facilitate that call. And then they also attend a second call each week, which is with all of the other facilitators and the writers. So again, we can build those understandings of the indicators for calibration purposes. And then the last member of the team is the writer. And the writer's role is a little bit different because they don't actually do any reviewing of the material. And the reason we have them not do the reviewing is we don't want them to put their personal bias or their personal interpretations of the materials into the report. So they listen to the consensus conversations, they listen to that weekly discussion, and then they look at the synthesis document that the facilitator puts together based on those calls. And they're the ones who actually then take all of that information and do the report writing. And so again, they have to attend the weekly team call to get the information about what that program is and what they need to write about that program. And then the weekly facilitator and writer call for that consensus building to make sure that what they're writing and the interpretation their team has for each of those indicators is consistent with how other teams are interpreting the indicators. And so for our science review that's currently going on, we currently have 29 reviewers. They come from 22 states in the United States. So the ones that are colored in gold is where we currently have reviewers from on our science teams. And they have an average, as we look across those 29, of almost 17 years of experience in education and over 500 years total when we add up everybody's combined experience. So we have really strong reviewers. As you can see from this map, many of our reviewers are from NGSS adoption states. Many are from states that adapted NGSS, and we even have some from states who adopted framework-based standards but didn't specifically adopt NGSS. So it's really important that they understand, though, the NGSS standards and the framework and the research that those standards were built on. And so to ensure those consistent and accurate reviews, we make sure that the reviewers are adhering to the evidence guides that we have, that they're following consensus protocol, that there's, again, that calibration in teams that you do with the weekly call, as well as across teams that we do with the weekly facilitator and writer call. And then we have an advisory panel, and especially in these inaugural reviews, our advisory panel has science experts who have been deeply involved in the development of the framework and deeply involved in the development and the implementation of the NGSS. And so as our reviewers are trying to find evidence in material, and as we're trying to determine, is this indicator set at the right level? Have we set the bar too high? Have we set the bar too low? Have we set it just right? We go to our advisory panel with some of these issues and get advice to make sure what our reports are doing is really representative of what the field needs in terms of materials that support NGSS. And then we also have EdReports staff support. So we, especially in inaugural reviews, we're on almost every facilitator, writer, and cluster call to help them with questions. Once reviews get more into that rolling process and we have experienced reviewers and experienced facilitators, that level of EdReports staff support becomes less important. But in an inaugural review, it's really important, especially to maintain that consistency and understanding of the tools until we develop some expertise and training of the people who are doing the reviews. So the tools themselves are our science tool, which is the rubric that we're using for scoring, was created by an anchor educator working group. So following that listening and learning tour, another group of educators who have been deeply involved in NGSS adoptions and implementations within their states were brought together, and they helped consolidate all of that information from the listening and learning tour into the tool or the rubric that we use for scoring. And that incorporated that national input from many stakeholders. We also looked at a number of other tools that are on the market, like the EQUIP rubric, PEAK, BSCS guidelines for NGSS implementation, and then the Next Gen AIM tool, which is now called the Next Gen Time tool. And so we looked at those indicators as well to see which same things made sense, what didn't, depending on the scale that you're looking at. So like the EQUIP is just at the lesson level. So there were other things we needed to add that EQUIP doesn't cover because we're looking at a whole series for a year-long program, and actually a 3-grade program. And so we had to look deeper than say just EQUIP. Next Gen Time looks at a much broader, so it starts looking at what kind of professional development needs will teachers have after implementation, what types of systemic changes will be made. Obviously, we don't go that far because we're just looking at what the material, so we fit somewhere in between those two tools, but we need to be informed by what both of those tools are looking at to make sure that we're also looking at consistent information, like the shifts of what 3-dimensional instruction looks like the shifts of what it means for a phenomenon or a problem to drive instruction. And so we have, the way our tools work, and this works consistently through our math tool, our ELA tool, and now our science tool, is what we call a gateway process. And so our gateway 1 is really this idea that it's designed for NGSS. And that's based on 3-dimensional learning and assessment, as well as phenomena and problems driving learning. And so within Gateway 1, we have 2 different criteria. The first one is this idea of 3-dimensional learning and assessment. So are the 3 dimensions present? Are they integrated for students to use for sense making? Are the formative assessments 3-dimensional? Are the summative assessments 3-dimensional in that they measure learning of all 3 dimensions? And so we have indicators designed to look for those particular questions. Our second criteria is this idea of phenomenon and problems driving learning. And so again, we're looking at, are they driving learning within lessons? And are we driving learning across lessons, like those bigger anchor phenomena that connect multiple lessons. For our reports, you need to meet or partially meet Gateway 1 to move for Gateway 2. So again, we have 3 different colors. We have red, which means does not meet. And if they get a red score in Gateway 1, we don't even continue the review, because if it's not 3-dimensional and it's not based on phenomena, it's truly not aligned to NGSS. So we don't even continue the process of reviewing the rest of the program. If they get a partially meets, which is a yellow, or they get a meets, which is a green, then we move on to the next gateway, and that's Gateway 2. And so Gateway 2 then looks for that progression and the scope and the presence of the elements from all 3 dimensions. We also look at things like scientific accuracy within Gateway 2 and whether it's grade level and meeting those grade band endpoints. And we only have 1 criterion in Gateway 2, which is a pretty big one, but it's that full scope of dimensions. And so we look at the DCIs, and is it hitting not just the DCIs at the big level, but all of those little elements. So if you look at the NSTA site that has all the bullets under each DCI, or you look at the appendix for the Next Gen Science Standards, we're looking, do they hit all of those bullets at the right grade band? For the DCIs, for the science and engineering practices, for the cross-cutting concepts, and even when we look at those connections between engineering and the nature of science that we see in those framework boxes of the standards, we're looking for the presence of that. We're also looking at, is there a sequence, and is that sequence coherent? And if it's a modular program, does the publisher provide some guidance of what a coherent sequence would look like? And again, to get out of Gateway 2 and proceed, now it needs to actually meet Gateway 1 and 2. So anything that was a yellow, a partially meets in Gateway 1, does not move, it moves into Gateway 2, but it doesn't move past Gateway 2. So this is where the review would stop if it only partially met Gateway 1. Or if it only partially meets Gateway 2, this is where the review also stops. If the materials have fully met Gateway 1 and they fully meet Gateway 2, then we look at the instructional supports and usability. And again, the reason we put this last is because if it doesn't have all the pieces, if it's not accurate, if it's not 3-dimensional, it doesn't matter how usable it is, because it doesn't have the pieces that our students really need in order to get to the rigor of the NGSS. And so we have 5 different criteria in Gateway 3. The first is to design to facilitate teacher learning. And so that's where we're looking at, are the materials designed to support teachers, not only in using the materials, but also in understanding the expectations of the standards. So are there teacher supports? In criteria 2, we're looking for student support. So are the materials designed to support all students in learning? For criteria 3, we're looking at, are the materials designed to be usable and also to support teachers in using the materials and understanding the materials, how they're designed. So these are the supports that say, that, you know, here's how it's designed, this is why it's designed this way, here's how it's been intended to be used. So what types of supports help teachers understand that? Criteria 4 really looks at the assessment design, and are the materials designed to assess students and support the interpretation of the assessment results? So are there rubrics? Are there suggested scoring guides for rubrics? Are there other information that help teachers make sense of the assessments? And if students miss this piece, and here's some interventions to do. Or if students are strong in this area, here's some extensions to do. So that's what that criteria. And then the last one, technology use. We don't actually give any points to it because technology isn't included necessarily in all programs. And so this is strictly a narrative, but if technology is included, are the materials designed to support the use of digital technologies? And so that's the pieces or the components of each of our reports. And so this is just then that big picture of what I've just said. So again, with Gateway 1, you need to meet or partially meet to get into Gateway 2. And then you have to both meet Gateway 1 and meet Gateway 2 to move on to Gateway 3. So when you look at the reports, if you go into our site and look at ELA or math, that's why you can see some programs only have a Gateway 1 report, is because they got a red in there, or they only have a Gateway 1 and a Gateway 2 report, because you have to meet everything to get to Gateway 3. And so these are the programs that we currently are reviewing. Amplify is Amplify Science, and again, these are all 6-8, full 6-8 programs. Carolina's Science and Technology Concepts, or STC. Discovery Ed's Science Tech Book. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's Science Dimensions program. And then we have 2 different versions of the TCI Bring Science Alive. We have their integrated version where they have all 3 disciplines in each grade level, and so they have a specific 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. And then they have a discipline specific where all their modules are based on, here's the earth science modules, here's the life science modules, or here's the physical science modules. So those are the 6 programs we're currently working on. And then next round of review, we're hoping to add 6 to 8 more programs. Our biggest constraint is finding enough reviewers to do the work on how many programs we can manage. And so here's a quick timeline. So again, January of 2018 is when we finished the listening and learning tour and brought together the Anchor Educating Working Group to draft the tool. In February and March, we recruited our reviewers. We were obtaining feedback on the tool from the field and from our advisory panel. We created the evidence guides and the processes and consensus protocols. And then we brought, at the very end of March, beginning of April, our reviewers together for a 3-day training. From April through December, we've been working on the reviews of reviewing those 6 series of middle school materials. And then we've been navigating all of those challenges and changes that we needed to make with our advisory panel, then having the weekly team calibrations. And then we actually brought reviewers back at the end of August for a 2-day in-person calibration training. We don't always do this, but with an inaugural review, it's really important that we do. And we're just wrapping up. We're getting the final reports from the reviewers, so those need to go through final copy editing. And then we need to send them to the publishers so that they have their 3 weeks to respond. And then we'll be publishing the reports in early 2019. So we're hoping to get those out. Right now, the date looks like early February, but depending with holidays and stuff with publisher response, we're hoping it will still be in February, but we're saying Q1 of 2019. And then our future timeline is, again, Q1 2019 is publishing the 6-8 reports, and then beginning a listening and learning tour for K-5. So now that we have the tools and everything developed for middle school, we want to move into the K-5. Early Q2 of 2019 will be training reviewers and beginning round 2 of middle school, and then working on developing all the K-5 tools following the learning and listening tour. And then summer, train the reviewers to begin the K-5 review. Q4 is publish the 6-8, and then about the same time next year as we'll be publishing these reports is to publish the K-5. And then continue having both of those on a rolling basis so we get as many publishers as we can. K-5 will also start probably fairly small with probably 5 or 6 programs, but we will be doing a K-2 set as well as like a 3-5 set for those K-5 programs. So we'll have twice as many reports because we have twice as many grade levels for K-5. And then eventually we will, beginning probably summer of 2020, start the listening and learning tour for high school, and then begin ramping up to do the high school review at the same time, continuing along with the middle school and the elementary reviews. So that's kind of the big picture of where we are. So I know there were some questions that came in or things that came into the chat box. So let me see if there's anything here.
I think some of that was a conversation.
Okay, awesome.
Caitlin did have one specific to you. Do you ever review, rate supplemental resources outside of publishers? For example, Brain Pop or Mystery Science, etc.
So we typically don't do supplemental simply because we're looking for the full scope of the standards.
Right.
And so we can, I don't think we have yet to date because I don't think they really exist, but outside of the formal publishers, I mean, we're open to do like OER resources if it's a full program. And so, but we don't do the supplemental because you're not going to see the coherence, you're not going to see the full scope of the standards, and those are our indicators, so they wouldn't score well if we're just looking at those smaller pieces, which is why we don't do those.
And then Kristen asked, do you review at the element level or just at the big picture level?
So we do both. So ours, Gateway 2 really digs down into the element level. So when we're looking for grade band endpoints and completeness, we're actually looking, are they hitting every middle school element for every DCI? Are they hitting every element for the cross-cutting concepts for the SEPs? So that goes to the element level. When we're talking about, is there three-dimensional integration, we're looking at what elements they're actually integrating, but some of our indicators are bigger and broader and just kind of, do we have a DCI and SEP? So we have both levels as we're looking, depending on which indicator it is. And so yes, those framework grade band, so it's both for, do you use a framework endpoints or the NGSS? We're looking really at those element level NGSS in most cases, and I'm going to qualify this. So when you look at the appendix for the DCIs on the NGSS, they don't fully explain the full element level for those grade band endpoints, but when you go to NGSS at NSTA, they have those full elements. So we go to that full endpoint for the DCIs. With the framework for the SEPs and cross-cutting concepts, that actually doesn't go into as much detail as what the NGSS does. So in that case, we look at the NGSS and the appendix documents, which are also, again, at the NGSS at NSTA site where they have those. So we basically go to the level that is the most detailed level. And in most cases, that's the NGSS or what's in those framework boxes in the NGSS. So that's the level that we're looking at.
Thank you.
And is there a reason McGraw-Hill was not on the list? Some of that was some of it was when can we procure the materials. Some were a couple of the publishers, as we were starting to do the review, we reached out to many publishers, and some said, especially with California coming up with their adoption list, and it was being released a few months ago, that they were making some revisions, and so they weren't done. And so we don't want to review something that, 2 weeks after our review is published, they've released a new version with lots of revisions. And I don't know if McGraw-Hill is one of the particular ones, but there were several publishers who said, we're right now in the middle of revisions. So we delayed them to round 2, and the ones we picked were the ones who said, we're done, we're ready to go. This is what we're marketing right now, is fully aligned to the NGSS. And so again, we wanted to pick the ones where the reports would would match the programs when we were finished.
Mhm.
And so how do you address materials that dip into the DCIs that are in the next grade band? That's a great question. What we look for with grade band alignment is there a meaningful purpose for where it is? So again, that comes in our gateway too. There's sometimes where we see things below grade band, and if they're there to scaffold up to grade band, our reviewers don't dock the publisher for putting them in. We don't take points. Similarly, if things are put in above grade band and it makes sense in a meaningful way, or there's not a lot of time spent on it, or it's an extension activity, again, we don't deduct. However, if you have a whole chapter that's above grade band, we're going to mark them down because that's a big investment of instructional time that could be used to develop grade band level understanding. And so a lot of it is what extent, what's the context, and those are the things that the reviewers talk about as part of their calibration conversations.
One of my concerns when I think about like a packaged curriculum is how do they attend to the uniqueness of my students? Like when I write a storyline for my class or when I put my materials together for my students, I would think about their interests and try and predict the questions that they're going to ask when I present them with a phenomena. So I wonder how a packaged curriculum could meet that uniqueness, that context that I'm going to get from my students. Like,
and so that's where, yeah, and I mean, that is the challenge. And that's one of the challenges that we had as we developed the tool, because we know that relevance and the cultural relevance and the students and the place and all of those funds and knowledge students bring are really important. And that's one of the limitations of the tool that we can use. And that's where a tool like Next Gen Time is really good, because then it's, now that you've kind of screened it down to potential ones that meet the basic requirements, which is what our report helps do. Now let's look at which of these high scoring programs best meet our particular site's needs. Another thing is, you know, do they give students the opportunity? Does the curriculum leave that space for students to ask the questions and maybe take different avenues of exploration of the questions that they have? And again, some curricula are more directive, some are more open-ended, that give students that room to explore their own questions a little bit more. But some of that is the work that individual districts do. And so that's where our goal of increasing demand for high quality instructional materials and hopefully getting publishers to respond to that demand and flood the marketplace with things that will ultimately be green will then give districts more options where they can look at multiple curricula that have high quality and pick the one that meets the needs of their particular student populations the best.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's a real challenge, but it's things you should definitely be looking at. And like I said, this Next Gen Time tool takes that to the next step of, now that we've narrowed our choices, which choice really meets our district priorities.
Excellent.
And then the next couple slides are just different ways people have used our reports. So those were, if we don't get to them because we've run out of time, that's okay, because we've really hit the meat of it right now. So.
Fair enough.
And I don't want to keep people off. I know people are, you know, giving up personal time to be here, which I super duper appreciate. So.
Right. Yeah, I'm so very appreciative to you, Lacey, for this presentation and spending this time with us. This has been excellent and informative. This is a good question from Kristen. I do want to remind everybody, you can unmute yourselves at any point in time and participate in conversation. I don't want you to think that you have to type your questions. So any of these ILSI comms are community-based.
Yeah, so the guidelines at this point, because we're in the inaugural review and we're just finalizing and making a few refinements, are not yet available, but as soon as we publish our first round of reports, both our scoring tool and our evidence guides will be available. And we've actually, with the publishers that we've been working with, we've been sharing our tools with those publishers so that they know what they're being evaluated against. And anytime we make revisions to those tools, we've been sharing that with the publisher. So it's not going to be a shock to the publishers. And then once, like I said, we have the first round of reports published, those will go on our website and then they'll stay on our website through all subsequent rounds. But usually that inaugural review is, we don't want to publish it when we're still kind of in draft form until the final reports are done. But once it's out of draft form, it will become completely available. Our reports are completely available. They're free. They're on the website. They're fully publicly accessible as well.
And it's a great way too, even if you're committed to a resource or curricular materials, it's a great way to look and see what the weaknesses of your particular curriculum are. It doesn't mean you have to throw it all away. It just, the EdReports is a great way to see where do you need to supplement? Where do you need to find additional resources to fill those gaps?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, we are at 4:38. So I'm going to go ahead and get ready to let everybody go. But I do want to point out, Heather shared our post survey in the chat window. So if you guys wouldn't mind clicking on that, it's just a short Google form, but that helps us provide impact data to our employers, and that's very helpful for us. And then I'll be sending out a link to the recording and some of the resources that Lacey talked about in her presentation.
And then if you want to contact me directly, here's my contact information. So there's my email address as well as my Twitter handle. And we will be recruiting. Our application is on the website. So if you're interested in being a reviewer, we encourage you to apply either for the 6-8 or the K-5 reviews. And we'll start interviews for reviewers probably in late January. So thanks everyone for attending. I really appreciate your coming and listening about our process and our reports.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Lacey.